Hey, Life Group leaders, Pastor Adam here. I hope you're doing well today. This week we're going to be picking back up in Jeremiah. We're going to be in Jeremiah 42. So we've got a few chapters between where we left off last week and this week, ending in chapter 36. So to kind of set up what's going on for you, as you've seen in Jeremiah, he is trying to tell God's people to turn from their ways and to follow him. And so what we see in the chapters leading up to today's passage in chapter 42 is that Jerusalem had fallen, that they were running scared for their lives. Things were not going well for them. Okay, so that's it in a really quick nutshell leading up to chapter 42. And today we're specifically going to be looking at verses 7 through 22 of chapter 42. But I think if you hear some more about the first part of chapter 42, it would help you understand what's going on. So at the end of chapter 41, God's people had said that they were planning on going to Egypt. So they made that clear. They were running, and they felt like if they went to Egypt that they would have peace there, that they would be safe. And so they've already said in 41 that they were going to flee to Egypt. This is where we're going to go. And then in kind of an odd turnaround in 42, they go to Jeremiah, a prophet that they'd been ignoring for about 40 years. And they say, Jeremiah, please tell us what we're supposed to do. Ask God what he would have us do. And so they asked Jeremiah, and Jeremiah says, yes, I will talk to the Lord your God, and I will come back, and I'm going to tell you everything that he says. I'm not going to hold anything back. So that's where we pick up in 42, verses 7 through 22. So I'm not going to read this all to save a little time on our video today. But obviously, as you're teaching the passage, read through this several times. Read chapters 40 and 41. That will really help you have a good grasp on the context of this. So it starts out in verse 7 of that section. It says, at the end of 10 days, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. So Jeremiah approached God on behalf of God's people, and then he took 10 days to hear back to see what God wanted them to do. So the people weren't sincere in going to Jeremiah because their hearts had already said, we're going to go to Egypt. So it kind of makes you wonder, why did they go to Jeremiah? Were they just going to different people, waiting for someone to tell them what they wanted to hear? Did they think it was just a good formality to put on a good face, put on a good show for other people that they would go talk to Jeremiah? There are probably a lot of reasons, but what we do know is that they really had no intention of following God's plan and not going to Egypt. All right, so in 7 through 18, Jeremiah gives them first a promise. He told them, he said, if you will go there, he says in verse 8, then he summoned Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the commanders of the forces who were with him, and all the people from least to greatest, and said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, to whom you sent me to present your plea for mercy before him. Here's the promise. God said, if you will remain in this land, then I will build you up and not pull you down. I will plant you and not pluck you up, for I relent of the disaster that I did to you. So he said, if you will do what I'm telling you, if you will stay where I planted you, you will not be plucked. Nobody will bother you. I will take care of you. Then he tells them in verse 11, he says, do not fear the king of Babylon, of whom you are afraid. So he tells them very succinctly, very concise, here's what you're supposed to do. And he does that in just a couple verses. A lot of the rest of this chapter is him telling them what's going to happen if they don't obey him, if they do go to Egypt. So Jeremiah went on behalf of God's people to God. 10 days later, he told them everything that God would want them to do. Now, if they were to leave and go to Egypt, God told them what would happen. He says, you're going to die by the sword. There's going to be famine, pestilence. It's going to be a horrible time. And he goes on to tell them this because he knew, and you see towards the end of 42 in verse 20, Jeremiah knew that the people didn't want to follow God. And obviously God knows these people's hearts, that they weren't going to follow him. So they told them exactly what they were going to do. Jeremiah called out their false motives, and their hearts were already in Egypt. They were insincere. In verse 20, Jeremiah says that you made Judah, God's people, you made a fatal mistake by asking me to go before God. Through your insincerity, your lack of honoring God, you have made a fatal mistake. But here's what we see, then this is what sin does, really. This is the way sin acts. Before they physically, in an outward sense, disobeyed God, they had already disobeyed God in their hearts. When they were forming their plan to go to Egypt, they had not gone to God's prophet. They had not gone to God and said, God, show us what to do. They made their plans, and then in a probably half-hearted way, for sure an insincere way, said, God, what do you want us to do? It's kind of, God, I want to build this kind of a house. God, I want to go on this trip. God, I want to marry this person. Fill in the blank. We make our plans, and then we ask God to give us guidance and direction. And then sometimes we wonder, why aren't these things working out? Maybe it's because it wasn't God's plan for us to do that thing. And so that's why we don't feel like we're getting guidance from God, because we never sought His will in the first place. And that's what these people were doing. They were saying, God, basically, bless our plan to go to Egypt, please. And He tells them that you're not honoring me. You've made a fatal mistake. You should not do that. The Bible also talks about, and your book talks about this week too, is that disobeying God never brings peace. Running from God never brings peace. Think about Jonah. Jonah was running from God. And he didn't have peace until he finally surrendered and submitted to God's will. And it's the same for you and me today. If we don't follow God, we will not have peace in our lives.